everyone. I'm Kathleen Stevens from the Korea Economic Institute, joining you from Washington, D.C., where it's a lovely afternoon. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to the latest in our the Korea Economic Institute's conversation series, a very special guest. And I'm happy to say a good friend of mine for many years, one of South Korea's most distinguished career diplomats, Ambassador Cho Hyun. Ambassador Cho is in New York, where he's serving as the permanent representative for the Republic of Korea to the United Nations. Of course, South Korea and the United Nations have a very special history and long relationship. I hope we can touch on that a little bit today, as well as the important role that South Korea plays in multilateral diplomacy and the UN in many of the issues that deeply affect the Korean Peninsula. But first, let me just give you a brief introduction. I think those of you who've joined us know who Ambassador Cho is, but as I said, he's a career diplomat who, prior to coming to New York for his current assignment, was the first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in Seoul. And before that, he was Korean ambassador to India. And in fact, has written a book about that. And if we have time, we might get to that as well. He has a long and deep history in both bilateral and multilateral affairs. He was ambassador to the Republic of Austria and South Korea's permanent representative to the international organizations in Vienna, of which, of course, there are many, from 2011 and 2014. And before that, deputy minister in Seoul for multilateral and global affairs. So I can't think of a more perfect profile for a permanent representative to the United Nations. And I think it's a sign of the importance that the Republic of Korea attaches to its work at the UN that they have sent someone of Ambassador Cho's experience and stature for this job. So I don't want to take any more time with this. I want to say we try to keep these conversations, given Ambassador Cho's very busy schedule. I think he's probably online pretty much in that office practically all day, but maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that. But we will try to keep it moving along, but we're going to talk for a while. And then I do want to leave time for questions and answers. So please, I think by this time, everyone's pretty familiar with Zoom. But if you have a question or a comment or a question for Ambassador Cho, you can start typing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And after Ambassador Cho and I talk over a few issues, I'll turn to the Q&As. As I said, what I hope we can do today is maybe get a sense from Ambassador Cho of what it's like to be at the UN right now in this extraordinary period we're all living through. He and I actually last saw each other just before things shut down in New York, and it's a different world for all of us, of course. But then I do want to hear a little bit more about what the UN General Assembly was like this year. We used to all go up there for that, at least in my diplomatic days, and very different this year. It'd be interesting to get his firsthand view of that, but then devote a good deal of time talking about some of the key issues for Korea and indeed for the United States at the United Nations, both affecting the Korean Peninsula and the many broader public multilateral issues that we are dealing with today. Trying not to prejudge our conversation here too much. But anyway, welcome, Ambassador Cho. Thank you for spending some time with us today. Could you just give us a sense overall of, we've been in this unusual situation now for almost half a year, I guess. I mean, how has the pandemic and all the measures been taken affected your work and more broadly the United Nations? And how is the whole UN system adjusted to this?
Thank you, Ambassador Stevens. Thank you for having me this afternoon. And also, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Well, the work of the United Nations has suffered a lot. And yet, the UN has been trying hard to mitigate the negative impact. And the UN headquarters building in Manhattan was completely knocked down in early March. Then from July on, slowly, we began to open it. And now meeting rooms are allowed for actual meetings, but only with the occupancy less than 40%. But more importantly, General Assembly and the Security Council and other organs have taken measures of silent procedure to adopt resolutions. In the meantime, there have been many, truly many virtual meetings. So many that diplomats here complain about Zoom fatigueness. Some diplomats joke that this is a proliferation issue, like a proliferation of nuclear weapons. But Kathy, you know how diplomacy works. It is important to have face-to-face interactions. By only doing so, we can exchange through ideas and information, and sometimes we get inspirations. But it is not possible. These virtual meetings cannot replace the real meetings. So I must say that this is a tough time for diplomacy. Kathy?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I imagine you have a lot of colleagues now on speed dial on your cell phone too, and spend a lot more time on that, but it's just not the same. Before we continue talking, and I said I want to get to the UN General Assembly and some of the things on the agenda now at the UN. But I wonder if you could say a word about Korea's response to the virus, because of course it's an example that's been much cited. Some jealousy has been expressed of it in some ways, but much admired, I think, because of the proactive way in which it's approached it. Has that had an influence on your diplomacy at the UN and how Korea is perceived and the kinds of issues you're getting involved in?
Yes, Korea was one of the countries hit hard at the beginning. And yet Korea was able to manage the pandemic relatively well up until today. Mainly because I think the Korean people are committed to making efforts for overcoming this pandemic. They wear masks and take all the precautionary measures, maybe because they are inured to wearing masks. Because as you know, in spring and fall, fine dust coming from China, people always wear masks. Our government was also better prepared than before because we were able to deal with MERS and SARS before. But I have no intention to brag about it. We should never be complacent, and we should remain vigilant until we have vaccines and therapeutic medicines. All along, the Korean government has been very transparent with the international community. We have shared the information and experience with the United Nations, for instance. We have provided many countries in need with testing kits and facial masks. Also, we shared know-hows. In July, we were about to have the Security Council election. And the election, you cannot do it virtually. So I talked to the Undersecretary General in charge and suggested that we can provide him with some ideas because we held the April 15th general election under the COVID situation without any infection. So we helped the United Nations in one way or another. We also, here in Mission, Korean Mission, launched the group of Friends of Solidarity for Global Health Security in May, with more than 40 like-minded countries at the United Nations. I believe this is a good platform to discuss how to cooperate in dealing with COVID-19 at the UN. Kathy?
Yeah, thank you for that. And you mentioned the election in Seoul in April 15th. You may know we're having an election here in the United States next week, and I won't ask you to comment on that. I'll leave it to Mary, our Q's and A's. But one thing that struck me about the election in Seoul was not only was it carried out with no uptick in the infection rate, but you had the highest turnout in several decades. So I hope that's another model that that my country can also follow as we have our election, and it looks like we're on pace to do it. So this obviously state of affairs continued longer than any of us really expected, I suppose, in the spring. And I know that there was a thought even in the summer that the UN General Assembly, which happens every year in September, and brings together so many, not only leaders, but so many senior diplomats and others to New York. I recall from my years as a diplomat, the whole State Department moved to the Waldorf. I mean, I'm exaggerating only slightly, as some colleagues on this in this conversation will know, but we would move up to the Waldorf Astoria with the Secretary of State to support a president, and then have many, many meetings. But I assume none of that happened. Well, I know none of that happened in September. So what did happen? What was it like?
Well, because of travel restrictions, no head of government or head of state came to New York for the high-level segment, no exception. And they sent their recorded statements. And only one person from each delegation, usually the ambassador, were invited to the big general hall where we were asked to introduce the president or the head of government for their statements. I was seated in this General Assembly hall with a big, long social distance with other ambassadors. I was feeling eerie, and I tried to find some, well, silver lining, for instance. Indeed, previously there were at around 120 head of governments or state who came to the General Assembly, but this year we had over 160 because it's easy to send a recorded message to New York, then travel to New York. I had the honor to introduce my president, President Moon Jae-in, before his pre-recorded statement. He gave a powerful statement calling for close international cooperation in fight against COVID-19. Kathy?
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I listened to that speech, and you're right. I think there is a silver lining that sometimes these speeches and other activities reach an even larger audience in this virtual age. But could I ask you just to follow up on that? I know he had a lot to say about North Korea, and I'd like to get to that a little bit later. But I understand that he proposed a cooperation initiative in Northeast Asia to deal with public health issues. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Indeed, it was a launch of Northeast Asia cooperative entity to fight against pandemics. And I think if it is launched, we can actually do more than just containing pandemics. It will contribute to the security in the region. Now we are calling for nations like China, Japan, North Korea, and Mongolia to do so. It will be hopefully a game changer in the region because we don't have that kind of regional entity.
Yeah, it's good. Well, that takes me to, I guess, and that's very much part of what I understand was the theme, which was decided upon before the pandemic hit, of the 75th UN General Assembly. And of course, 75 seems like a pretty significant year to mark in the UN history. And I read that the theme was the future we want, the UN we need. That reminds me of a Rolling Stones song, but the future we want, the UN we need, reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism. I mean, you know, here in the United States, I'm not sure that there's a sense right now that multilateralism kind of fell out of favor. I know, you know, and there's always been some suspicions in the United States about, I guess, the UN and some of its activities. But I wonder, again, do you see what's happening in the world now, the COVID crisis in particular? Did you see it kind of strengthening or fraying this sense that there was a place for multilateralism? I mean, this Northeast Asia initiative you mentioned is a good example, I think, of an effort to do so. But more broadly speaking, what was the sense at the General Assembly and at the UN more broadly this autumn?
Well, There have been some disappointments and even criticism about the United Nations, as you just described. But we should never forget that it is not the United Nations, but the member states of the United Nations that make the course. And if you look at the current situation, in which we see greater need for collaboration globally, I think eventually we will overcome this through close cooperation. We have a history at the United Nations. Back in 2000, we came up with Millennium Development Goals. And in 2015, SDGs. So we can do it again. So I think eventually member countries like the United States and Korea will work together to come back to the beauty of multilateralism. Kathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, that point you made is one I often make to my friends and family in the United States about the UN, that it really, the power is in the hands of the member states to make it, you know, make it work or not. And I think that's sometimes something that's a little bit forgotten. But given that, I mean, the other sort of challenge in addition to the pandemic is the growing tension between the United States and China and the real deterioration in that relationship. And there's two important, obviously, permanent members of the Security Council, and for Korea as a country that has important equities, an important alliance with the United States, a very important economic relationship with China, as well as, of course, being a neighbor and important on North Korea. How do you see that? I mean, the U.S.-China growing competition and tension affecting what you're trying to do there, and more broadly, some of the UN goals.
Well, China's rise has become a reality we face every day here at the United Nations. We cannot but feel the growing presence of the United Nations. For example, when I was here as Deputy Ambassador in 2006, China's budgetary contribution was only 9th. Now it is the second, just behind the United States. Under these circumstances, we are indeed witnessing growing tension between the United States and China at UN in different contexts. After all, countries promote their interest here at the United Nations. And when there is conflict of interest, it is well manifested at the UN. But nevertheless, I must argue that there is a need for Washington and Beijing to cooperate whenever possible and whenever necessary. And one area of such cooperation is taking place in the North Korean issue, particularly the North Korean nuclear issue. Both the United States and China share the common goal of complete denuclearization and permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. And because of this converging interests of the two countries, the Security Council was able to adopt 11 sanctions resolutions. As Korean ambassador to the UN, I try my best to keep the Korean issues stay in the realm of such cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that I hear a lot of people worry about whether or not going forward, the U.S. and China would be able to find that kind of common ground on Korean Peninsula issues. But of course, that's one of the big challenges for you and for all of us. But turning kind of in a way to South Korea now, and Korea has, should I say, a very special relationship with the United Nations. I think a lot of Americans aren't really aware that, I mean, certainly aware of some history of the Korean War and the fact that it was UN Security Council resolutions that brought the forces that defended the Republic of Korea along with Republic of Korea forces in 1950. There continues to be something called the United Nations Command, and resolutions that are, so there's all that. But Korea wasn't even, you can explain this, a full member, being a divided country, a full member of the United Nations until 1992. And you were mentioning to me that so next year is the 30th anniversary of the Republic of Korea, as well as the DPRK's full accession or full membership in the United Nations. And I just wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on those 30 years, if you like, and the role that UN diplomacy has played in Korea's diplomatic goals, and what Korea has contributed.
Well, thank you for raising this question, because the UN has been with Korea from the very beginning, although we became a full member only in 1991. Because of the UN's engagement with the birth of the Republic, and then the Korean War, as you know well. So I sometimes think about it. Without the engagement of the United Nations, the history of Korea might have taken a quite different path. Now that Korea has become one of the most successful stories since the Second World War, we try to pay back to the international community. We provide substantial economic assistance to many developing countries through the United Nations, with the United Nations. Also, we send troops to military conflicts around the world, notably the peacekeeping operations in South Sudan and Lebanon. And Korea is the 10th largest budgetary contributor to the United Nations. But for some specific institutions like UNICEF, Korea is the 4th contributor because of our private sector contribution. Mm-hmm. And as for the UNV, United Nations volunteers, we are the 2nd, because there are so many Korean young people who volunteer to work at the United Nations. Indeed, there are almost now 1,000 Korean citizens who work for this secretariat in different parts of the world. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the 8th Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, whose election, by the way, was the good result of close cooperation between the United States and Korea.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, well, I did not know that about the UN volunteers too, that the 2nd largest contingent is Korean. I've certainly seen over the years South Korea's key role in the peacekeeping area, and bringing highly capable forces to some of the most difficult circumstances. Very interesting. So what about, I think implicitly some of the things you talk about underpin US South Korean cooperation in the UN, because we do share not identical goals, but many, many similar ones. And I wonder if you could say a word about working with the United States within the UN, and some of the key areas where you see us working together.
Right. As Korea has become a relatively important country at the United Nations, our cooperation has also become more important than before. Our alliance is the linchpin of stability and security in Northeast Asia. And likewise, here at the United Nations, this is an important cooperation at the UN. Well, President Moon Jae-in, in his address to the Korea Society earlier this month, you might recall, he stressed that the Korea-US alliance was initially forged as a military alliance, but it has evolved, continued to expand, moving beyond a security and economic alliance toward a global partnership. And this is exactly what I see at the United Nations. I see continuing and growing cooperation in voting and other issues like non-proliferation, terrorism, cybersecurity, and of course, human rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for highlighting all that. And I think this is the kind of cooperation that happens, if you like, a little bit behind the scenes and doesn't get a lot of attention. But again, I'd have to say, just from my own experience over the years, whether in Washington or in Belgrade or in India, I often found that my colleague from the Korean embassy was one who was, as you were saying, doing work sometimes in areas where the United States did not have as much capacity or was constant, or sometimes we were in the same area, but whether it's in a capacity building for security forces or police, or whether it was in the areas of women's empowerment, there's a whole range of things that I think we do on a day-to-day level work together very closely. But now I want to turn, of course, to North Korea, because I know, you've made clear, and I think all your predecessors also, it was a very high priority and takes a lot of your time as you work in New York. I know, as you said, that President Moon and his speech to the Korea Society highlighted his desire to see a peace process move forward, and you were very much tasked with that. But before we even get to that, the UN also plays a big role, obviously, in sanctions enforcement and also in the whole question of humanitarian assistance and human rights. Now, there's a whole lot in that question, so I'm just going to, or there's a lot of subjects there. It's not even a question yet. But, you're in such a pivotal position on these issues. Maybe we could start with, again, kind of the pandemic and the issue of humanitarian aid, which has been very, very sensitive, right? Both in terms of what and how Pyongyang is prepared to accept, but also what the international community, or the UN and its member states, are prepared to do vis-a-vis sanctions, vis-a-vis all the concerns that come up. Could you give us a sense of how you see these issues?
Yes, because of North Korea's strict quarantine measures in response to COVID-19, we know that they are in a dire situation. So whenever there is COVID-19 related humanitarian assistance, we cooperate with the United States in getting the exemption of the sanctions very promptly. But going back to the framework, indeed, North Korean issue is the priority for me. It is the most important issue for me. While my government has been pushing for the peace process on the whole on the Korean Peninsula, here at the United Nations, we deal with it with three dimensions. As for the sanctions, we are committed to faithful implementation of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions in close collaboration with the United States. As for the humanitarian assistance, yes, my government upholds the principle that humanitarian assistance should take place regardless of the political situation. And finally, on the third committee, we talk about the human rights issue, or human rights situation in North Korea. And we are closely cooperating with the United States and international community, of course, to meaningfully improve the human rights situation in North Korea. Well, I must say that we have seen ups and downs in inter-Korean relations. But nevertheless, what is important is that we should not backpedal from the advancements that we have achieved.
Mm-hmm. And in that regard, then, I know that Seoul has put a big emphasis on trying to push forward, to say not backpedal, but to continue to try to implement confidence-building measures to build trust, particularly on the inter-Korean front, but more broadly. And there were some important agreements that have been reached over the last several years. What's your sense about where they are now and what the path is to try to move forward on those?
Well, as for the confidence building measures, the most prominent one was the September 19 military agreement, which came out not out of vacuum, but of all the inter-Korean summits and the summit between the United States and North Korea. Back in 2017, after missile firing by North Korea, there was some concerns about the situation. Expressions like fire and fury made me very concerned about the situation. But President Moon took advantage of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games, and he was able to make a breakthrough by engaging with North Korea. And the summit happened. And as a result, we were able to reduce the tension and build some confidence measures. Now, it looks like it's stuck, but I don't think it's gone. We will come back. So I hope we will be able to build on the confidence building measures we have achieved so far.
Mm-hmm. That kind of brings us to the fact, of course, that we have a US election coming up as well. And I know that's watched closely on the Korean Peninsula. But, you know, before we get to that, and I know there are probably limits to what you can or will say about that, but I want to ask you about prospects after our election. I do see a few questions that have come up related to this whole subject of how we move forward on North Korea and where we are in terms of sanctions and human rights, some other things, particularly things that are very much centered in New York. So if I could, I'm going to turn to the questions we have in. We have a question from someone you know very well, Bob Einhorn, who asks you this. So with your permission, I'm going to ask you a few of these questions. And you've also agreed very generously to stay on a few more minutes. So we'll take a few questions and say maybe wrap up by looking forward a little bit in terms of what's happening here. And I'd still like to get to India. Otherwise, we'll get you back another time for that. Mr. Einhorn asks, the UN Sanctions Committee on North Korea is tracking enforcement of sanctions against North Korea. It seems that there is now large-scale evasion of sanctions, including perhaps with the approval of China and Russia. So what is your impression, Ambassador Cho, of the implementation of sanctions enforcement against North Korea?
Well, I cannot totally agree with him in the sense that sanctions regime has been undermined severely. There are some people who want to evade the sanctions and make some problems. But it's just like a police regime. There are some troublemakers, but the regime is very solid as long as it is there. My sense is that here at the United Nations, China and Russia have been relatively cooperated well with the United States. That's my sense I get. And I believe this is also shared by the US UN here. Mm-hmm.
So the issue of the enforcement of the sanctions or the implementation of the sanctions is not something that has been deeply discussed.
Not really.
Yeah.
Not really.
Yeah. You know, I mean, my sense, it's an important issue. And I'm thinking again of other places where we've had sanctions regimes. I spent a lot of time in the Balkans, and enforcing sanctions is always a moving and very difficult to maintain kind of policy approach. So it takes constant adjustment. The other kind of set of questions we have, and the similar ones from Terence Mazzio and Greg Scarletto, is about the issue of North Korean human rights and the role of the UN. And it's over this question of South Korea's position on whether there should be a UN resolution on North Korea's human rights violations, and what kind of approach South Korea would like to see to the issue of promoting human rights in the North.
Well, we have been constantly supporting the resolution on human rights situation on North Korea at the United Nations. Sometimes, however, we try to have a balanced act, because when we propose something very big, like the end of war declaration, which I believe will be a good, remarkable thing towards the getting two objectives of the permanent peace, and also complete denuclearization. It's a sensitive time. Then we do not join the original promoters of the resolution. But eventually, we support it. And there is no difference between them because it is adopted as such at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So it's a question of timing and yeah, thank you. So let me just return now back to what I said I was going to raise earlier, and that is kind of your forecast. I mean, you've had many positions, but so from your long experience, we have this big election coming up next week. We always think our elections are big ones, but this one seems especially consequential. And I know they're always very closely watched everywhere, but particularly on the Korean Peninsula. What's your prediction about U.S.-South Korean relations in the aftermath of the election? I'm not asking you to predict who will win, but what's your sense?
Well, before I speak about it, let me talk about the nature or characteristics of our alliance. I think U.S.-Korea alliance is not only based on our common interest, but most importantly, based on our shared value of liberal democracy and market economy. And this is the reason why our alliance is strong. Well, why and how is that so? There are many reasons, but let me tell you three things at least. First, Korea has been sending the largest number of students to America. Korean students, number of them are only third after China and India, but per capita wise, we are the first. They come here, study here, live in American culture. So I don't need to tell about the ramifications of many Koreans studying in America. Secondly, there are 2 million Korean Americans. They are the linchpin for our alliance. And thirdly, we have BTS and others, K-pop. They reach out to young Americans and they communicate with them and they are connected with each other. So let me ask this question to you. Do you believe BTS or movie like Parasite can be produced in an authoritarian regime? No, not possible. So I must argue that Korea and the United States peoples are peace-loving, wealth-producing, and law-abiding people. Therefore, whoever wins next week, our close cooperation on many bilateral and global issues will continue. And above all, our two governments will maintain airtight cooperation on North Korea to achieve complete denuclearization and permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a big agenda ahead, but Ambassador Cho, I share your fundamental confidence, I think, in the resilience of our relationship. And I have to say, I also agree with you that, because I would say, I think it's based in a very deep way, which I personally feel, and I know you do too, on shared values, you know, mm-hmm. and people talk about, politicians, diplomats talk about shared values, shared interests, and so on. But it's, you know, we've talked about a lot in the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War, but it's so much has changed in those 70 years. I was actually in Korea, the first time I was in Korea, as you know, was the 1970s as a Peace Corps volunteer. And I well remember the day, because I was in the countryside in Korea when it was announced on the Korean television that Jimmy Carter had won the presidential election. And of course, the one thing that Koreans knew, at least the Koreans I knew about Jimmy Carter, was that he had said he was going to pull out all the troops from South Korea because of South Korea's human rights violations. Now that's a whole other story, and I'm not going to take your time. But you know, it reminds me of the point you made that what we have now is a sense of shared values of really treasuring our democracies as flawed and noisy and difficult as they are, and really treasuring the ties we have as people who fundamentally, I think, aspire to the same thing. So, so it's going to be a challenging time ahead, and I think it'll be a challenging time ahead at the UN as well. But you've made a very good case, I think, for Korea's role as a not just a champion, but a skilled practitioner of multilateralism, as well as a country that really is taking a leadership position in many areas in multilateral fora and in its bilateral relations with so many important countries, including our own. So I thank you very much. I don't want to detain you too long, but I thank you very much for this conversation. We'd love to have you back again. I do hope that diplomacy will return to the UN in terms of before the 30th anniversary of South Korea's entry to the UN, and that we can have a time where all those relationships and contacts and hopefully progress towards the very challenging goals, very challenging issue we still have is made possible. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And as people talk about 90% of economy, I feel like diplomacy here at the United Nations is just like that. We need to recover the rest 10% to be sooner than rather later. And by the time we keep in touch. And again, I go back to my emphasis on the strong alliance between the United States and Korea. I hope we can talk about some other issues, but I think I've spent all of my time focusing on the US-Korea alliance.
Well, we appreciate the attention to that, but I think putting it in the context of what you're trying to achieve at the United Nations has been very informative, and I've certainly learned a lot from it. So I thank you again. I'm actually going to take a moment to preview for those who've joined us today, and I thank everyone. Something that I think follows this conversation in a rather interesting way and appropriate way. On Monday, the 2nd of November, my colleague Mark Tokla is going to have a conversation with Yoon Sun, who is a senior fellow and the director of the China program at the Stimson Center. And the title of this, you might like this, Ambassador Joe. I didn't ask you about this, but maybe you can join us on Monday. China's high volume Korean War commemoration. A lot of us noted that this month, President Xi Jinping gave a speech which marked China's entry into the Korean War in 1950, and it's been much remarked upon. So if you're interested in a conversation about that, we're going to do that on Monday. So please join us then. And again, Ambassador Joe, thank you so much for joining us today, and all the best to you in your very important work.
Thank you. Goodbye now.